Kjære alle sammen, hjertelig velkommen til lansering av boken Hvordan tenke langsiktig i en kortsiktig verden. Den er skrevet av Roman Krznaric. Velkommen til dere som har møtt opp fysisk her på Kulturhuset i Oslo, og til dere som følger arrangementet digitalt. Lanseringen er et samarbeid mellom forlaget Respublika og Tankesmien Agenda. Og boken den kan selvfølgelig kjøpes bak her i lokalet eller på nettet. Then I will switch to English for today's event. I would like to start by saying welcome to the author, Roman Krznaric. His book, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, has received well-deserved praise around the world. It is now out in Norwegian, published by the brilliant publisher Respublika. I would like to congratulate you both. Mr. Krznaric is a public philosopher who writes about the power of ideas to change society, and he has done so in several international bestsellers. After growing up in Sydney and Hong Kong, Krznaric studied at the universities of Oxford, London, and Essex, where he gained his PhD in political sociology. Krznaric has been named by The Observer as one of Britain's leading popular philosophers. Mr. Krznaric will give us a brief introduction to the book before we welcome Mr. Dag O to the stage for a conversation. Mr. O is a professor of biology at the University of Oslo. He is a distinct voice in the debate on topics like evolution, climate, ecology, and biology as a way of understanding humanity. He has written a large number of books, amongst them The World at a Tipping Point, which is also published by Respublika in 2020. And just last week, he published yet another book, Life, or Liv, in Norwegian. So congratulations to you too, Dag. My name is Catharina Bu. I work for the Norwegian think tank Agenda, and I will do my very best moderating this event. So, without further ado, please, Mr. Krznaric, the digital stage is yours.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Catharina, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Dag and you as well. And I'm sorry I'm not with you all there today, but I'm here in London. And I'm here to talk to you and introduce, in a way, this new book of mine, which I'm delighted has been published by Respublika in Norway, which is all about long-term thinking. But behind long-term thinking is the problem that we face in society, which is the tyranny of the now, the chronic short-termism that we live in today. And I think that has to really be our starting point for thinking about this issue. Because I think we all know that we do live in this age where the present tense is so dominant. Our politicians can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet or headline. And I'm sure you're thinking about that a lot in Norway with the election just coming up in the next week or so. And businesses too can't see very long term. They can't see beyond the quarterly report, and markets spike then crash in speculative bubbles. Nations sit around international conference tables arguing with each other while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as individuals, we're looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. And it's clear we need more long-term thinking to deal with multiple challenges in the 21st century. We need it to plan for the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need it to think about risks from new technologies like artificial intelligence and bioweapons. We need to look at the long-term impacts of racial injustice and wealth inequality. And of course, we need more long-term thinking to deal with the global ecological crisis. I mean, I've got here part of the report of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 2021 report, which really makes you think about the long term. Of course, it stresses how the impacts of climate change are happening today, but they're also going to be going on for decades and centuries. There are projections here going forward to 2100, 2200, 2300 about temperature rises, sea level rises, and these are exactly what our children and their children are going to inherit. And I think the real problem here is that we have treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risks as if there was nobody there. And the tragedy, of course, is that all those generations of the future aren't here to do anything about it. They're given no political rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace. And it can be quite difficult to, I think, get our heads around the scale of this injustice. But if you think of it this way, that, there are 7.7 billion people alive today, but then in the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born, amongst them all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And I think there's a real question there about how those future generations are going to remember us. I mean, Dag has written in one of his recent newspaper articles in Norway about how we've stolen the future from those future generations. And I absolutely agree with that. And someone else who thought about this issue a lot, and someone who's inspired me, is the immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s. And Salk concluded that if we were going to deal with the big challenges of our time, the destruction of the living world, the threat from nuclear weapons and other threats, he said, what we really needed to do is to start thinking long term and thinking on a scale not of seconds, minutes, and hours, but on a scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. And he believed there was one question that we needed to put at the center of our thinking, of our politics, of our society, was this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by the generations to come? And that's one of the key questions at the center of this book. But then you might think to yourself, okay, it's all very well to talk about thinking long-term, thinking on the scale of decades and centuries, but are human beings even capable of doing that, especially if we are always looking at our phones? Well, I believe we are. And the way I think about it is, inside the human brain, there is a constant struggle going on between the forces of long-term thinking and short-term thinking, or what I call the marshmallow brain for short-term thinking, and the acorn brain, which is all about long-term thinking. The marshmallow brain is the part of our neuroanatomy which focuses on short-term rewards and instant gratification. Now, it's named after the famous marshmallow test from the 1960s, a psychology experiment you might know of, where a marshmallow was put in front of children, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. And it turned out, of course, that the majority of kids couldn't resist and snatched the snack and gobbled it up. But the marshmallow brain, which is what gets us clicking that buy now button, isn't the only part of our brains that matters. It's not the whole story of the way we think about time, because we also have wired into us what I call the acorn brain, which is the part of our brains which focuses on long-term thinking and planning and strategizing. And it lives here in the frontal lobe, particularly a part, if you're interested, called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And it's a new part of the brain. It's only about 2 million years old, whereas the marshmallow brain is about 80 million years old. We share it with rats and other mammals. But the acorn brain is actually better developed in human beings than in most other creatures. So, for example, other creatures do plan for the future. So a chimpanzee plans ahead a little bit. They might get a stick and strip off the leaves to turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. That's planning ahead. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. But that is exactly what a human being will do. We are experts at the temporal pirouette. Our minds can switch from thinking short term to thinking very long term in an instant. It's the acorn brain that's allowed us to plan for our pensions or write song lists for our own funerals. It's the acorn brain which has enabled us to build the Great Wall of China and voyage into space. So the real question is, how are we going to switch on this acorn brain so it kind of wins a bit more of the tug of war against the marshmallow brain? And in my book, I talk about 6 different ways we can start thinking long-term, like a conceptual toolkit. And I want to just mention briefly 3 of those before we have a bit more of a conversation about this. One of them I want to talk about first is the idea of cathedral thinking. And that's the idea of embarking on long-term projects and plans, which might be going forward decades or even centuries. Of course, it's named after the famous medieval cathedral builders who would start building their religious edifices knowing they would probably not be finished within their own lifetimes. Famously, the Lutheran church in Ulm in southwest Germany was begun in the 1380s. Well, it wasn't finished until 1890, more than 500 years later, one of the world's longest crowdfunding projects. That's cathedral thinking, literally. Of course, more metaphorically, Greta Thunberg has talked about how we need cathedral thinking to deal with the climate crisis. And this cathedral thinking we find emerging throughout human history. Think, for example, not just of religious buildings, but of, for example, the sewers that were built in Victorian London in the 19th century after a time called the Great Stink, when the stench, the smell was so bad, tens of thousands of people were dying from cholera because raw sewage was being dumped in the River Thames, and the government finally passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers. They were built over a period of about 18 or 19 years, and those sewers are still in use today because they used really expensive bricks and a special kind of cement. It was all about long-term vision. We don't have nearly that much in most political systems now. But I think Norway is a really interesting example because there are plenty of instances of cathedral thinking linked to Norway. Consider, for example, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault funded by the Norwegian government, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker that's designed to last for 1,000 years. Of course, we also know that the temperatures are rising so fast it may not be as safe as people think. Norway, of course, has done long-term investment in healthcare and education for decades for young people and older people. And then, of course, there is Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the pension fund, which on one fundamental level, with its $1 trillion worth of value, is all about long-term thinking and preserving finances that are going to help both current and particularly future generations. But I think the sovereign wealth fund, though sometimes held up as a great example of long-term cathedral thinking, also shows almost a dark side of cathedral thinking because, as we know, the sovereign wealth fund, well, where do those funds come from? They come from fossil fuels, from Norway's oil and gas exports. Norway is the 8th biggest gas exporter in the world, the 15th biggest oil exporter in the world. And I think there's fair grounds to say that Norway can be considered an international drugs dealer. The drug is fossil fuels. And so this is a kind of cathedral thinking which has very negative impacts on future generations, both global future generations and also Norway's own future generations who will have to live with the impacts of the fossil fuels which are being used to generate the income of the sovereign wealth fund. So I think it tells us that cathedral thinking isn't always good for us. It's not enough to just think long-term in itself. Long-term thinking and cathedral thinking needs to be joined with other approaches to thinking long-term. And some of these other ones are ones I discuss in my book. And one of them is the idea of intergenerational justice, a second cognitive or mental tool for long-term thinking. And intergenerational justice is all about considering what are the ethical and political responsibilities that we have to future generations, and how do we bring them into our public institutions, particularly our political institutions. And this is something that interests me a lot because many years ago, 20 years ago, I used to be a political scientist. I was apparently an expert in democracy, but it never once occurred to me during that time that we, in a way, disenfranchise future generations. We fail to give them rights or representation. It never even occurred to me, but now I think I can see that. And once you see it, it's very difficult to unsee. There's a question there, how do we, in a way, give those future generations a voice or represent their interests in politics? And that's, of course, very relevant for this election that's coming up in Norway. And I think there's really interesting models to look at in other countries. So, for example, in Wales, not too far from where I am now, just a few hours away, in Wales, they have a Future Generations Commissioner. It's a non-political public position, and the Future Generations Commissioner's job is to look at the impact of public policy up to 30 years ahead, whether it's in education or healthcare, environment, employment. And other places are starting to follow that example. In Scotland, there's now a strong campaign for Scotland to have a Future Generations Commissioner, and I'm part of a campaign for the whole UK to have a Future Generations Commissioner. So that's one kind of model. Now, a second kind of model, I'm going to literally model for you here by putting on this gown, if you just bear with me for a moment. Now, this gown is a genuine gown from the future design movement in Japan. Now, let me tell you about future design. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a grassroots decision-making movement, which is based on the Native American idea of seventh generation decision-making, found in many indigenous cultures around the world, of making decisions based on the impact 7 generations from today. But they've kind of translated this idea to the fast-moving world of modern Japan. And the way future design works is that local people are invited to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they're typically divided into 2 groups. Half of the participants are told that they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these ceremonial robes to wear. And this is one from the town of Yahaba in northern Japan, population 30,000. And the people wearing the gowns are told to imagine themselves as being from the year 2060, so 40 years in the future. And it turns out that the residents from 2060 systematically advocate far more transformative plans for their towns and cities, whether it's long-term investment in healthcare or action on climate change or dealing with the threats of automation and artificial intelligence. And I think what's striking to me about future design is not only has it been studied in depth by economists looking at the impacts, so it's very well documented, but it's also spreading to big cities like Kyoto. It's being used in Japan's Ministry of Finance and big companies like Fujitsu as well. And future design is really about citizen participation and democracy. It's telling us that when you bring local people together, they will take a longer view in general than your politicians who are caught in those short-term electoral cycles. And this is all about citizens' assemblies, which of course exploded around the world in Ireland, Belgium, Spain, Canada, and other countries as well. So I think that's another really interesting model. And then I think a third political approach for dealing with intergenerational justice is to look at the legal sphere. Because one of the great shifts I think that's been happening in the last few years is the rise of legal cases, often brought by young people who are campaigning and bringing court cases against their governments, claiming that their future rights and interests are being violated. In the United States, there is an organization called Our Children's Trust, which has sued the federal government, and they're campaigning on behalf of 21 young people who are saying that their rights to a clean climate and healthy atmosphere have been violated by the government's subsidizing of the fossil fuel industry. It's a long-term ongoing court case. You might know about similar cases recently in Germany in the Constitutional Court. The Fridays for Future movement brought a case successfully against the government, saying that the government was effectively violating the rights of future generations by having very slow carbon reduction targets, which were going to have a burden really on future generations more than present ones. In the Netherlands, there have been similar cases. And of course, in Norway, back in December, there was the well-known case where young people and other environmental organizations brought a case against the government to try and stop them doing new oil drilling in the Arctic, and they lost. 11, I think, of the 15 judges ruled against it. But I think that ruling was against the historical tide, that I think there's more and more of these legal cases trying to claim rights for future generations and also rights for the living world as well, which is a whole nother legal area. So I think there's enormous energy around trying to change our political institutions to make them more long-term, because look, you can have all the sustainable development goals in the world that you like and carbon reduction goals, but if your politics is still caught in short-term cycles, you're not going to get very far, and you need these institutional design changes. So I've said something about cathedral thinking, something about intergenerational justice. Let me just finish by saying something about one of the third out of 6 different ways to think long-term, which is the idea of developing a legacy mindset. This, in a way, is closest to the ideals of Jonas Salk, the immunologist. And I think thinking about our legacies, we can think forward, as in what legacies are we going to leave for future generations? But a good place to start, I think, is looking at the past. You can think that we have inherited incredible positive legacies from the past, the cities we still live in or medical discoveries we benefit from. But we have also inherited negative legacies in many countries of slavery and colonialism and racism that create deep inequities that must now be repaired, and legacies of economies that are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth, which must now be transformed. And so there's a question there about, well, what legacies are we going to transform or leave for the generations of the future? But it's quite difficult to connect with those future generations, make an emotional connection. But I think with a bit of imagination, we can all do it. Look, I can close my eyes and think about my 12-year-old son. And I can try and imagine what his life might be like when he's 90 years old. I imagine him sometimes at his 90th birthday party, surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and work colleagues. I go and look out the window at the world out there. And sometimes I think about what would he say about me, about what I did or didn't do when I had the chance to do something. And that's where we are now in today's society. And I think one of the interesting things about thinking about young people in your own life, a child or grandchild or nephew or niece, is when you think about them in the future, you know, when my son's about 90, it's going to be nearly the year 2100. You know, that future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. And if I care about his life, what I've realized is I have to care about all life, because he is not existing in a vacuum. You know, in the future, he's going to be part of a web of the living, of local community, of people who support his life and family and friends, but also the web of the living world, the air he breathes and the water he drinks. So if I do care about sustaining him, it's about sustaining everybody. It's about caring for the place that will take care of our offspring, the one unique planet we know that sustains us. And that idea of thinking about our legacies, I think, is reflected in fantastic cultural projects. In Norway, there's the great Future Library developed by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, where every year for the next 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread in the Oslo Public Library until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in the forest just outside Oslo. So that's a fantastic long-term legacy project which asks us all, I think, gets us to think about what legacies do we want to leave for the future. But ultimately, we can look back at our own lives and also at our governments and say, okay, what are we doing as individuals, but what are our governments doing to take a longer view? And in my book, towards the end, I present a new index of long-term thinking called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which ranks 122 countries on their long-term public policy in terms of environment and healthcare and economic indicators too. And one of the interesting things about it is that whereas Norway normally comes top of all these indicators of well-being and equality and happiness, it doesn't do very well on the Intergenerational Solidarity Index. It comes down at number 26 out of 122. Why? Because it's penalized because of its fossil fuel exports and fossil fuel production. And I think, you know, that's the great sin that, you know, Norway or the world sees Norway as committing. And I think any government which is committed to caring about future generations is going to get itself off fossil fuels, is going to shift its ecological mindset. And I think if we all do that, our institutions, in our businesses, in churches, in our communities, in our families, we might well become the good ancestors that future generations deserve. And with that, I'd like to stop and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Roman. I'm sure we have a lot of things to discuss now. I would like to welcome also Dag to the stage to take part in the conversation. I thought we could start by dwelling a bit on the problem first, before we look more into possible and political solutions. However, I would like to start by asking you, Roman, if it is okay that I call you Roman, what inspired you to write this book?
What inspired me to write this book was a kind of frustration. I don't know if you felt this, but you know, for years I've been picking up newspapers or looking at them online and seeing people complaining about the excess of short-termism and the need for more long-term thinking, whether it's in politics or business or architecture, design, science, whatever field it is. And I kept on seeing people saying, we need more long-term thinking. But then I asked myself, well, what is long-term thinking? Are there different kinds of long-term thinking? Is it always good for us? What's the history of long-term thinking? So I really wanted to answer those questions. But of course, I also felt this kind of urgency when I came across that question from Jonas Salk, you know, are we being good ancestors? It hit me like a kind of bolt of lightning. That was some years ago. And I thought, that is the question, which in a way unifies so many of the things that I worry about: the ecological crisis, technological risks, long-term public healthcare investment, all these different things. The common denominator in a way is how we're going to be remembered by those generations to come. So in a way, this is where the book came from, and knowing, of course, that my children will inhabit the future, you know, and I'm not going to be around here when they are trying to live on this one planet we know that sustains life. So in a way, that's where it came from.
Dag Hessen, you have written extensively on the climate crisis, and as a biologist, you know better than most of us what the rapidly changing climate does to nature. Without going through the whole IPCC report, could you briefly mention some likely scenarios in the near and far future for the planet we live on?
Well, the last IPCC report said in principle nothing new, except that it speaks a bit louder. There are better statistics. We know we have even less time than before. And there are some really hard-kicking numbers in when we will exceed 1.5 degrees, which is inevitable, and also 2 degrees, and also that we are currently heading towards somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees. And of course, on top of this is all the disasters we have witnessed this year with droughts, fires, floods, well, all kinds of disasters. So actually the habitable niche, as we say in biology, on the planet is shrinking, and will be definitely parts of the planet that will not be able to sustain human life, and not either a whole suite of other life forms as well. And it's important to state, of course, that the loss of nature and climate change is tightly interlinked, because after all, nature takes care of more than 50% of our CO2 emissions.
And Roman, you write about in the book how neoliberalism and consumer capitalism has led our societies to believe in this endless economic growth, and this growth is kind of a mean to human progress. And you're also very clear when you state in the book that this is conflicting with what Hessen points to, this ecological civilization. And you demonstrate this in the book with a quite daunting graph showing how human impacts on the living world have accelerated rapidly since 1950s. And Hessen, you have written about the same trend in your book, The World at a Tipping Point. But even though the evidence is so clear, it seems so difficult to do something about it and to change the way we think about progress. Why do you think that is, Roman?
That's a big question. I love it. Well, of course, the idea of progress is so deeply part of the Western worldview, dating at least back to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the idea that the natural path must be growth, 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 the curve going ever upwards. And of course, what we've seen is that economic growth and development has been rising, particularly in the Western world in the last century, at least, you know, as Dag knows very well, and, you know, we've been talking about here, there's the great acceleration as well. Everything else is going up as well. CO2 emissions, deforestation, ocean acidification, and so on. And so I think it's really difficult to shake off that ideology of progress, also because governments are so addicted to the idea of constant economic growth, whether they're left-wing or right-wing or in the center. Since the Second World War, the de facto public policy goal, I think, for most countries, as economists like Tim Jackson and others have argued, is that goal of constant growth. Yet we know, and this is something I think I've learned very late in life. You know, I studied economics 30 years ago, but when I was presented with a demand and supply diagram like this, there was something missing, which was a circle around it called the biosphere. I never learned about that. I thought that, you know, the demand and supply diagram was just floating on a white background, right, with no limits. But of course, there are the planetary limits. And however you think about them in terms of planetary boundaries or using other models, we are massively overshooting those. So what we need to do is get off the addiction to constant growth and that idea of progress, and think about progress in different ways. But we need to accept the idea of boundaries and not be afraid of boundaries. You know, when you think about it, sometimes if I talk about, oh, we need to stay within planetary boundaries, you know, there's people like Johan Rockström and Will Stephan have argued in them, you know, and others in many papers. People get afraid. They think that means limiting growth, you know, life's going to get worse and so on. But boundaries unleash creativity. You know, Jimi Hendrix played on a 6-string guitar. You know, Mozart played on a 5-octave piano. Serena Williams within the tram lines, the boundaries of the tennis court. So we need to recognize that we can have human well-being without having to keep going up a growth curve, which is throwing us way beyond boundaries. And we know there's no systematic evidence that we can decouple economic growth from CO2 emissions and material use at anything like the pace and scale required to stay within safe planetary limits. So it's a very, very tough ask. You're fighting against 300 years of history, but there are important movements going on to challenge this idea and obsession with progress.
But some people would argue that green growth is possible. Do you think green growth is possible, Hessen?
Well, it could be part of the solution, but it's very naive to believe that it's the solution. And again, even green growth requires resources, and many of them are scarce and hard to recycle. So the whole idea of continuous growth, even green growth of the so-called decoupling, is a bit naive. I certainly believe that technology is part of the solution, but it's not the solution, and certainly not the only solution. But I also touch upon quite a bit of this question. We know this. We know that we should behave different, etc. Why are we not able to do that? And I think part of the story is, of course, that as long as we can remember, which is, perhaps 100 years back, not really remember, but historically remember, growth has been a success. It has created better lives and better health, more freedom, at least in our part of the world. So it seems to be this kind of endless success story. And why change something that is so successful? The point is, of course, that we are now over the edge, at least in our part of the world, where the growth is no longer needed. It just growth per se. The purpose is growth itself. So, but I also like to say that I've been waiting for this kind of book for a long time, and it was really such a relief and pleasure to see it and read it, because I also, as an evolutionary biologist, I've been pondering about these questions for a long time. I mean, in all our history, it has paid off to take the resources here and now. There's been few humans in an endless world. Now this is turned upside down. There's about to be endless number of humans in a shrinking physical world. And we still are geared towards this optimizing the intake and use and materialism. So I think there is, lots of good things to say about human. We are passionate and we are empathic and we are able to cooperate. But I think we are evolutionary geared towards this fast returns, which of course is the problem also in economy, that you need fast returns all the time.
And in an op-ed...
Can I just sorry to interrupt you, but what Dag was saying there just reminded me something about what he's written about in the past, which which is about curiosity and wonder, about caring passionately about the living world. And I think actually in that idea is, in a way, one of the solutions here, because I think when I think about the problem of long-termism, it's not just about trying to think decades ahead. It's as much about place as about time. And in my book, I describe how the great biomimicry thinker Janine Benyus asked this question: how have other species survived and thrived for 10,000 generations or more? And she says, well, it's by taking care of the place that will take care of our offspring, by not fouling the nest, this small niche, as Doug's saying, that's getting smaller and smaller. And I think if we're not going to foul the nest and destroy the ecosystem, in a way, we do need to fall in love with the living world, with fjords and ice sheets and savannas, by taking care of the place that will take care of those future generations. So I think in that sense of wonder and passion and care about place lie some of the kind of the deeper solutions around the values that we need to hold.
But in an op-ed this summer, Dag, where you also mentioned Roman's book, you wrote that evolution gives no recipe for how to solve global problems that we have created ourselves. Isn't that a bit problematic then, that evolution is working against us?
Yeah, in some cases, I hate to see it, of course, but evolution is not the recipe for everything. And we are, of course, equipped with this ability to think beyond evolution and beyond what's short-sighted, rational for us. And I think this goes exactly to these two parts of the brain, the candy and the nut brain. That and this also is what Kahneman writes about in Thinking Fast and Slow. Of course, quite too often we are short-sighted and we follow the immediate desires, while we, of course, rationally believes and knows that we should behave different. We are able to overcome this in our daily life by saying, no thanks, no more chocolate. We can resist a very attractive person. We can do these kind of things. But we are to deal with this rational thinking in a long term. So, and I mean, there are many signs of this. Of course, we still like sweet and salt and fat food, because this has been limitations in the past and very important to go after. Today, of course, this is completely irrational and unhealthy, but we still have these desires.
And Roman, I have to admit that when I read your book, I checked my phone more than once. It was my Marshmallow Brain who made me do it. How do you think new technology affect our ability to think long term?
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about new technology, because on the one hand, you know, you get a lot of the Silicon Valley kind of people saying, well, technologies are going to solve all of our problems for us, you know, carbon capture and storage and things like that. And there's this kind of utopian view that we can just keep living how we've been living always, keep flying, keep shopping, and that technology will come to our rescue. Yet, you know, these technologies are far from proven. And I think we need to be thinking as much about changing our values as developing new technologies. And I think the other thing is that, I mean, I'd like to be more positive about new technologies. In some ways, wouldn't it be great if there was amazing virtual reality experiences that could really get us to inhabit and be part of what the world is really going to be like in 2100. But even the best films, Blade Runner or Beta, whatever, when they try and send us into the future, they tend not to change us that much. So I don't have huge hopes in sort of technological solutions, whether it's virtual reality or carbon capture and storage. But I certainly think that there are all kinds of technological innovations that we, you know, could be bringing into the world. But I think the innovations we need are less in terms of technology, but more in terms of, you know, new innovation in terms of government regulation. I mean, think, for example, a city like Amsterdam, right, has set very strict targets for its creating a circular economy. 100% circular, no waste basically by 2050, 50% circular by 2030, 10% of government services and procurement must be circular by 2022. And that is creating all sorts of innovation in businesses who are providing housing or garbage collection and stuff. So let's say that I have more hope in innovation than in technology itself. But I'm interested to hear what Dag has to say about that too.
Would you like to comment, Dag?
Yeah, I also have this mixed feeling. Certainly technology is here to stay, and there's lots of good things to say about it. And as I said, it will also be part of the solution. And when we imagine the future world, it has to be some smart technology there. I mean, it's not appealing to most people to go back to what has been and be freezing inside a cold cabin eating cold porridge. I mean, that kind of life is not really appealing, although it's dematerialized. But again, this naive claim that the technology will solve everything, and the technology in itself demands resources that are scarce, is not only naive, but it's really dangerous.
A central argument in your book, Roman, is that we need to strike a fair balance between meeting the needs of current and future generations and finding ways to represent the interests of the citizens of tomorrow, or what you also call future holders. This will require that we create a society based on intergenerational justice, as you also mentioned in your introduction. But is it possible to give rights to future generations, human beings who are not yet born?
It's a pretty weird idea, isn't it? I mean, the idea that you could give rights to people who aren't even here yet, but we're actually seeing already legal innovation in this area. Like I mentioned, you know, in my introduction there about these campaigns to give rights to future people. Sometimes the legal cases, like in the Netherlands, the well-known Urgenda case, is about trying to not give rights to people who are not yet born, but to consider the impacts of, for example, the fossil fuel industry on the lives of children who are alive today, but looking 10, 20, 30 years ahead. But we give rights to all sorts of different entities. I mean, in the late 19th century in the United States and across we gave rights. Crazy idea. And, you know, now today there are legal cases to give rights to the living world. So in Aotearoa in New Zealand, the Wanganui River, which is sacred to local Maori people, has been given rights, the same rights as a person. So I don't see why we shouldn't be giving this rights to future generations. Of course, there's all sorts of other things that governments can be doing to try and speed up its, you know, reduction of carbon emissions and, you know, stopping, you know, new oil exploration and reducing current production, you know, to very strict timetables and things like that. But I really think there's much more possibility in these legal areas than I'd ever previously imagined. You just have to look at all these recent court cases and in Pakistan and other countries too.
What do you think, Doug? How do we do this in practical terms?
Yeah, well, we discuss rights for non-humans, rights for big apes, which in some ways is a good thing, but of course we should probably care for humans first. We also have, there are cases where there are claims of human rights for robots, advanced robots. So definitely we should have rights for the unborn. A puzzling thing is that when most people are asked what do they think about the future and how far do you see the future, what is the future, most people tend to think that this is something that might be 15 or 20 or 30 years, or at least not beyond my lifetime. So that's a very strange constraint in our ability to imagine the future. But I think this has also to do with meaning. To me, I would think everything would look bleak if I knew that humans would disappear 100 years from now. We have been here for 300,000 years, something like that, and why shouldn't we have that kind of perspective? Because we can agree that there is a moral right for the non-born, but to imply legal rights is, of course, probably a larger step.
Because I must say, as a person who works normally on international development, and I have spent the last year reading about how the corona crisis has affected poor people, poor countries, and how it has increased inequality in the world, I do struggle a bit to see how leaders of today take a greater concern about people who are not yet born. What is your response to disillusioned people like me?
Well, I think we think about those things all the time. Actually, when I was writing the book, I sent a draft copy of it to a friend of mine who is the CEO of a big British international aid organization, Save the Children. You know, that works in international development. And the first thing he did after he read it, he said, I can't stand this book. Look, you're thinking all about the future generations, but what about today? There are 150 million children dying of malnutrition. You know, how are you going to deal with that problem? And so we ended up having these really interesting debates and discussions about how do we balance the present and the future. And I think what we actually came to realize in the end, that often there's an overlap, an unexpected overlap between the interests of current and future generations. And in fact, if you look at Save the Children's big coronavirus report, it talks all about being a good ancestor. Why? Because there's a recognition, I think, that long-term investment in healthcare and education helps today's children and helps tomorrow's children as well. It's about building the public service infrastructure that all countries need. And I think this goes the same for action on climate change too. I mean, if you talk to the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, her name's Sophie Howe, what she tries to do is find the sweet spot between the interests of current and future generations. So things like taking action on, you know, renewable transport and getting rid of air pollution and so on. It helps today's generation. It also helps tomorrow's generation. So I don't actually think there's as much conflict as people think. And ultimately, what is it that we all need? We need air to breathe, water to drink, food to eat. We need the basics of life. And I think deep down, that's what international development is all about. It's about basic human rights. But what the founders of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights didn't realize when it was written in 1948 was the impacts of the ecological crisis. It wasn't yet here. And I think if the Universal Declaration was rewritten today, it would have a lot more in it about future generations. And I think international aid agencies would be responding to that too, as they already are.
Another key term from your book is time rebels. Who are these time rebels?
The time rebels. Yeah, it's, when I started writing this book, I started realizing how many people there are who are committed to taking action on long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. And I tried to invent a name for them, and I thought of the name of time rebels, because I think rebellion and dissent has always been an important part of social and political change. Think of, the Gandhi leading the salt marches against, the British in India, or the suffragettes fighting for women's rights in Britain in the early 20th century, or in the United States, or the civil rights activists in the United States. These were all rebels. And we need a new kind of rebellion today, which is about thinking about the impacts of the ecological crisis, particularly on future generations. And so the Greta generation, which includes, my kids, I've got 12-year-old twins, they are kind of natural time rebels. They're angry in a way about what recent generations have done and are doing to their future. And so, I admire and support those sort of acts of rebellion in a way.
One of the groups you mention also in the book is Extinction Rebellion, and they have received some attention here in Norway also lately. And critics say that they should rather work through political parties or democratic organizations. What do you think about that response, Dag?
Well, again, there are some mixed feelings. I have supported Extinction Rebellions, and I even signed a poll they made some years ago, which caused a quite uproar. Of course, we want, in principle, everything to go within the rules of democracy and rights, etc. But clearly, there are cases where we need rebels, and probably to realize that the unborn have rights demands that kind of rebels. One of the books I enjoyed reading was Steven Pinker's *The Better Angels of Our Nature*. And he makes this point that along with education and illumination of societies, rights also come. Slaves got rights, women get rights, then animals. The idea about rights has continuously been making us more humans. And now I think the time has come for the rights for the unborn, and it probably takes some rebels to really push that forward.
But in your book, Roman, you argue convincingly that democracy and not authoritarianism is the best system for dealing with long-range challenges. At the same time, you advocate for a new political model that you call deep democracy. And one of your suggestions to deepen the democracy are so-called citizen assemblies. And I believe that's what you also wrote about in that op-ed, Borgerråd. And I very much agree with the need to find new ways of expanding our democracy. I must say, however, that I'm a bit skeptical when you argue that these assemblies, and now I quote from your book, would have powers rivaling elected legislatures or town councils with the authority to delay or veto policies that impact negatively on the basic rights of future people. So how do you see that such powers to veto fit within the representative democracy?
Well, I think representative democracy is dying, and it needs to be radically changed and improved, not thrown away totally. We still need representatives, but I think we need different kinds of democracy in the mix. The idea of the citizen assembly goes, of course, back to ancient Athenian democracy and the idea of direct participation. And I think this is important not just for thinking about long-termism, but across the Western world, democracy is dying. Traditional representative democracy is dying. That the number of people who are members of traditional political parties is falling. We've got the rise of far-right authoritarianism across Europe in many countries, both Eastern and Western Europe. So I think we need to revive faith in democracy. And I think citizens' assemblies is one of the ways of doing it. And I'm not saying it's easy to do. National politicians don't like giving up their powers, but of course they have given lots of things away in the past, like the privatization of public services across Western Europe since the 1980s. I mean, I think there are complex questions about what powers that citizens' assemblies should have. I mean, when they introduced a Future Generations Commissioner in Israel that had the power to veto, the Knesset, the parliament, didn't like it very much. So I think what we've been campaigning for in the United Kingdom is a future generation commissioner who can not simply veto legislation and stop the parliamentary process, but that can take government departments to court for failing to meet clear targets, for example, on carbon reduction or reducing child poverty. But I think to make all of that work, we need these direct action movements like Extinction Rebellion, like Dag. I've been on the streets with Extinction Rebellion in the UK because I know that one of the lessons of human history is that you don't get fundamental change unless you have people dissenting against unjust laws and unjust policies on the ground. When all other avenues have failed, that's what happened in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, you have to try something else. You have to block a bridge, or sit in a part of the bus you shouldn't sit in. And that's what Extinction Rebellion is doing today, because that's the stage we're at. We've had 30 years of knowing about the impacts of climate change since the Rio conference, and we need to find other ways to revitalize democratic citizenry and civil society.
Do you agree to this?
Not really. I think this is also where one of the points where, or probably the point where I disagree, and that has also to do with I don't really have that trust in most people, especially if this includes some sacrifices of today's goods to the benefit of those not yet born. And what would the term opplyst enevelde be in English?
Someone knows.
Of course, when you have
authoritarian enlightenment or something. Yeah.
Of course, when you have one single person that really writes the rules, let's say the China type of system, it might work well as long as there is the good leader, but you never know when this turns around. So I would still vote for democracy and not the least international cooperation in this context. Of course, we can see that.
Yes, Roman.
So I was just going to say that I absolutely agree that the idea of a benign dictator, enlightened despot, the dream that we can have things like China or Singapore to solve our problems. I've looked at the evidence on this. It's just not strong. You have to be very lucky to have an enlightened despot. They tend not to stay enlightened and benign for very long. And the data shows that democracies tend to have much better long-term public policy outcomes than autocratic governments. But there's still a lot of work to do in all democracies, including in the Nordic countries, of course.
And you mentioned the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and you have several examples of cathedral thinking in your book, and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is one of them. And throughout the history of the fund, there has been many discussions related to ethics, climate investments, and management. What do you think, Dag? Do you think that the Norwegian politicians will change the way the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is managed in order to take a greater climate responsibility in the future?
Yeah, this is a topic I have lots of opinions about and had for a long time. I was part of the ethical council in the state pension fund for a long period. And when I entered this ethical council, I had this naive idea that part of our mandate was to give advices to where to invest or not to invest. For instance, do not invest in coal for obvious reasons. That turned out not to be the case, but still we had these strong discussions. Why shouldn't the sovereign fund, claiming to have this long perspective, withdraw investments from coal? So even, the fund itself is really something to be proud of in Norway. It's really a good and long-sighted fund. But as you said, of course, it's based on fossil fuel. And also, it's basically to the benefit of Norwegian citizens living here in a few generations. not really for those that are not yet born, or at least those that are to be born 100 years from now. And there's been such a strong resistance to use the fund or withdraw the fund from fossil investments. Just recently, they agreed to divest from coal, and then just with the argument that this was strictly for economic reasons. Had nothing to do with climate or ecology, because then it would be politics, and God forbid. But as long as you could say that this was strictly due to financial reasons, then it was okay. So, I mean, the fund is also both long-term and good in some way. It's the ideal way of placing the wealth from the oil income. On the other hand, it could be much more progressive in really being to the benefit of the distant future, I think.
And we are less than a week away from an election here in Norway, and the politicians who are elected will sit for only 4 years. But some would say that choices that they make now is perhaps the most critical in time and more important than ever. If I could give you the opportunity to just give one advice to the politicians that will lead Norway for the next 4 years, both of you, what would that be, Roman?
Well, look, I don't pretend to have any expertise in Norwegian politics, but when I look at Norway, especially with the COP26 climate talks coming up, I mean, Norway, there's never before in human history has there been a country as wealthy as Norway, or not nearly. It's absolutely extraordinary. And if Norway can't take the lead on taking action on cutting its fossil fuel emissions, then what hope is there for the world? And Norway is in a better position than any country in the world, or at least one of the most best positioned to immediately stop new exploration of oil and Arctic drilling, and then to rapidly close down production of fossil fuels. And I know there are different dates that different political parties say, well, this should be by 2035 or a different date, but the sooner the better. It's got a sovereign wealth fund and other funds that can help finance the admittedly difficult challenge of course, there are 160,000 people involved in the fossil fuel industry in terms of employment. None of this is easy, but Norway should be taking global leadership on this in the lineup to COP26.
Doug?
Well, unsurprisingly, of course, I echo all that. I completely agree. And I also would have one very concrete advice, and that is to urge all politicians to read your book, to really see beyond the next 4 years. I think many politicians are capable of doing that, and certainly do, but of course they're also trapped in this re-election. And this is not only about the politicians, it is also about the voters. We also need, all of us, to have a more long-term perspective.
Unfortunately, we have to end the conversation here, but I do hope you will all read Krznaric's book, also any politicians following us live. And please do your very best, I know I will, to use my acorn brain and plan for future generations. And not the least, that you vote Monday for someone who does. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and especially thank you to Roman and to Dag.
Thank you very much. There's the acorn.